Yo, what is going on, my dudes? Welcome to another RuneScape news coverage video. For this video, we're going to talk about mining and smithing once again. Specifically, we're going to talk about the smithing overload that I touched on in the previous video. So without any further ado, let's get right in the video. Let's go.
Cats is the illest. What you talking about, Willis?
Alright guys, so all this information we're talking about in this video is coming from a design document that Mod Jack just put out. So I'll have a link down in the description below if you want to go ahead and check it out for yourself. And if you're watching this probably a couple days or weeks after this video's been uploaded, it's likely that some of these things have been changed or have been added to the design document. So keep that in mind. This is just a design pitch. It's subject to playtest and feedback, just like anything else with mining, smithing, rework. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the content. Now, the smithing overload, and I have touched on this in the previous video briefly, but we can get in the inner workings of exactly what it is and how it's going to work. It's essentially called, I guess this is the name they're going with, armor spikes. Just to give you a basic rundown of what they are. Now, armor spikes are going to be a new untradeable reward for high-level smiths. They are a temporary buff, which is going to give your player a thorns effect, and this effect will cause any enemy who strikes you at an adjacent space away to take damage. So they have to be 1 square away, melee distance, in order to receive damage. The amount of damage they take actually will scale with your smithing skill, but it won't scale with the incoming hit. So it appears, at least on the surface, that they're going to have a fixed amount of damage. It's not like a reflect where if you get hit with a really high hit, you're going to bounce back a lot of that damage. It's solely based on your smithing level, how much it'll do. Now, armor spikes work when using only melee weapons and armor, and are especially effective if you're using a shield. So how are you going to be making armor spikes? Armor spikes are never actually made as a consumable. Instead, they're going to be applied to the player as a buff directly to themselves through smithing, but the buff lasts until it is used up in combat. So this is a buff that's going to remain constantly active so long as you're doing melee with melee armor and melee equipment until it is used up or until you disable it, which I'll talk about towards the end of the video, how that works. Now, to gain the armor spikes buff, the player takes a Elder Rune bar to any anvil and makes the, quote, armor spikes item like any other smithing project. The recipe will require 90 smithing to make, and it also requires 1000 progress to make as usual for a Elder Rune bar item, which translates to about 1 minute to make. Smithing XP is awarded at the same rate as making any base Elder Rune item. Now, rather than adding an item to the player's inventory, completing the recipe will then add 1000 stacks of, quote, armor spikes buff to the player. The player can add the buff again and again, and it stacks up to a total of 10k stacks, at which point no more can be added. They are going to be making a convenience recipe that will allow you to do 5 or 10 lots of spikes to be made in one single go. Obviously, this would take 5 or 10 times more bars and progress to make. Now, from a concept standpoint, the player is technically adding the spikes to their equipped armor, but from a gameplay standpoint, or from a technical standpoint, in terms of the game code, adding spikes to specific pieces of armor would conflict with invention, would prevent armor from stacking in the bank, and cause a whole bunch of other bugs or complex workarounds necessary. So instead, they've gone with a generic buff added to the player character. In terms of using your armor spikes, once the player has the armor spikes buff, they can keep it until it's depleted, as I said earlier. They can keep it even when not wearing melee armor, but it only functions when wearing full melee armor and using only melee weapons. But each time a player is attacked by an enemy, mind you, they need to be in melee distance, 1 stack of the armor spike buff is consumed, and the enemy will take X amount of damage. Now, they still need to playtest and find out exactly what that damage value is, but like I said early on in the video, it does scale with the player's smithing level. The damage is dealt whether or not the enemy hits or misses, but won't scale with how much damage the enemy inflicts on you. An additional bonus is if a player happens to be wearing a melee shield, the damage dealt by the armor spikes will be doubled. So that's actually pretty interesting and might create a new melee tank meta, assuming these things end up being viable. We're gonna have to wait and see though, but early signs look like that's a possibility. Anyways, if a monster dies to an armor spike damage, and the player hasn't dealt any damage to it any other way, the player will not get credit for that kill. This will allow skillers to use the spikes similar to like a ring of recoil, but will prevent them from just sitting there with an aggro pot and getting a whole bunch of loot without putting any work in. Which is good that they thought that ahead of time. Anyways, to replenish your stacks of armor spikes, all you really need to do is just return to any anvil and add more spikes to the buff. Again, remember that you do need Elder Rune bars to create them. Which, once the economy settles down, I'd imagine it'd be a relatively cheap thing to do. And finally, we're going to touch on disabling and enabling the armor spikes. If the player has a stack of armor spikes, but for whatever reason chooses to not want to use any of them up, 2 additional smithing recipes available to disable and enable it. Both recipes do not require any progress, instead completing them only with 2 hammer strikes on an anvil. Completing this, quote, disable recipe removes the player's armor spikes buff. The buff no longer visible and no longer works in combat, but the number of spikes the player had is still remembered, so you won't lose any of those if you choose to disable this ability. This recipe is only available when the player has at least 1 stack of the buff. Completing the quote enable recipe gives the player back the armor spikes buff, as you would imagine, with a number of stacks equal to the number they had when they last disabled it. This recipe will also be only available when the player has at least 1 stack of buffs stored. The player should be able to see how many stacks they have stored by looking at this recipe. And that pretty much wraps it up for the armor spikes buff. Let me know what you guys think about it down in the comments below. Again, I will have the design document so you can look at it at your own in the description. So do check it out, and if you have any feedback you want to give, do give it to Mod Jack. This is his idea that he's pitching to us, and it's likely, as I said earlier on, if you're watching this sometime in the future, that he may have added or changed some things in the design document, so I do encourage you to go check him out if you have the time. That being said, let me know, are you satisfied with this, or would you prefer something different? Love to hear your thoughts. I'm gonna wrap up the video there. If you have enjoyed it, hit that like button. If you're not subscribed yet and you want to stay up to date on all things RuneScape related, then hit that subscribe button. Anyways, I appreciate you watching. I am out. Peace.